Dean, Smith and Grace. If you ever served your time in a British toolroom, you knew the name, and you knew you had to earn the right to lay your hands on one of their lathes. These were the machines Rolls-Royce trusted to turn the parts inside its aero engines. At their peak, around 1,000 men in white made-to-measure overalls worked the Keighley shops, and 1 in every 5 lathes in wartime Britain came from beside the Worth. They came through 2 world wars. They survived the Depression, foreign competition and rivals that fell away around them one by one. And then, after more than 120 years of making, the gates closed, and the town that had timed its very holidays to the works fell quiet. How does a firm the finest engineers in Britain trusted, a firm that survived everything, simply disappear from the town it built? Chapter 1. The Men Who Borrowed the Land. Keighley sits where 2 rivers meet, the Aire and the Worth, in a fold of the West Riding, under the gritstone moors that climb towards Haworth. In 1865 it was a wool town, growing fast, loud with the clatter of looms. And in that year, 3 men borrowed money to buy a patch of land from the Duke of Devonshire, and set about building a works. Their names were Joseph Dean, James Smith and John Grace. Dean was the eldest, born in 1824 over in Barnoldswick, a man the works would remember for the rest of its life as Old Dean. Smith had come into the world in 1834, Grace in 1840. 3 Yorkshiremen, none of them wealthy, all of them certain of one thing. A town full of machines would always need someone to build the machines that built them. That was the trade they chose. Not cloth, not wool. Machine tools. The lathes and planers and boring mills that shape the metal everything else is made from. In a town that lived and breathed textiles, they went one level deeper. They would make the tools behind the tools, and on the land they'd borrowed against, beside the Worth, they raised the Worth Valley Works. It was a hard start. Machine tools are a slow, capital-hungry business. You spend money for months before a single finished machine leaves the shop, and you carry the debt while you wait. For years the 3 men carried exactly that. There are stretches of the early story where the partnership's survival looks like a near thing, a matter of one good order arriving before the money ran out. But the orders came. By the 1881 census, the firm employed 75 men and 30 boys. A proper works now, apprentices coming through, a name beginning to travel. And by 1883, the debts were clear. They owned what they had built, outright, at last. What turned it was the quality of the thing. A DSG catalogue from 1889 lists the customers they were already chasing and winning: locomotive builders, marine engineers, ordnance manufacturers, boiler makers, shipbuilders. Government contracts among them. This from a firm barely 20 years old, run by 3 men who'd started with borrowed money and a field. They were not making cheap machines for the local mills. They were making heavy, serious machines for the people who built the engines of an empire. And those people had noticed. There's a phrase that machinists still reach for, more than a century on, when they talk about a Dean, Smith and Grace lathe. They call it the Rolls-Royce of Lathes. It's worth understanding, before we go any further, exactly what that meant, because it wasn't a slogan the firm invented, and it wasn't loose praise. It meant a machine built without compromise, hand-fitted by men who took days over work. Another firm would rush in hours, engineered so far beyond what the specification required that it would still be cutting true half a century later. It meant the most expensive way of doing a thing, done properly, because the people who built it could imagine no other way. That instinct, do it properly, whatever it costs, built the firm. In the end, it would also be part of what killed it. But that is a long way off yet. In the 1880s and 1890s, it was simply making them the best in Keighley, and then among the best in Britain. The partnership formalised itself as the years passed. It became a limited company in 1898. 10 years later, in 1908, it reconstituted as a private company, Dean, Smith and Grace, 1908, Limited, the name it would carry through both world wars. The founders were aging by then. Grace died in 1904, Smith in 1906, and old Dean himself in 1909, at 85, having seen the field beside the Worth become one of the great engineering names of the West Riding. They left behind more than a works. They left behind a way of thinking about a machine, that its worth was measured not in what it cost to make, but in how long it would go on being true. Everything that followed grew out of that single, stubborn idea. Chapter 2. Built for brute force. The moment that made Dean, Smith and Grace what it became arrived not as a decision in a boardroom, but as a new kind of metal. Around the turn of the century, a revolution swept through every machine shop in the industrial world: high-speed steel. Cutting tools made from it could bite into metal far faster than anything before, and they generated forces to match. Suddenly, the old lathes, built for gentler work, for slower speeds, began to flex and chatter and shake themselves loose under the strain. The tools had outrun the machines holding them. Most firms responded by patching the old designs. DSG did something else. They stopped building bespoke machines to each customer's whim and concentrated instead on a single idea taken to an extreme: rigidity. A lathe so massive, so heavily geared, so utterly unwilling to move under load that the new steel could be driven as hard as it would go, and the machine would simply stand there and take it. How far they took it is best measured by a figure from 1904, when the American trade journal American Machinist described a new 16-inch DSG lathe. It could strip metal at a rate of 1,800 pounds of chips an hour. 1,800 pounds, the better part of a ton of steel, reduced to swarf every hour by a single machine. For its day, that was an astonishing, almost violent number. It announced that a small firm in a Yorkshire wool town had re-engineered the lathe around brute force and beaten the field at it. The engineering underneath was quietly brilliant. The beds were cast not from ordinary iron, but from a high-strength mixture the trade called semi-steel, hard enough to register around 200 on the Brunel scale, ribbed diagonally, so the ways stayed stiff while the chips fell clear. The headstock spindles were massive, carried on 3 bearings, the front bearing on the largest machines swelling to nearly 7 inches across. There was a patented spindle nose they called the fast lock, and the option of precision: Timken taper roller bearings, or plain white metal ones fitted by hand. But the defining quality was simply mass. Weight. Their smallest lathe, the so-called baby of the range at 13-inch swing, weighed getting on for 3 times what a Colchester student weighed, and 80% more than a Colchester 15-inch Triumph, a machine of larger nominal size. A DSG was, pound for pound, in a class of its own. There's a line the enthusiasts use that captures the firm's whole attitude. It did not demean itself producing piffling little lathes. It made only, as they put it, very serious machinery. It had rivals, and good ones. Britain in those years was thick with machine tool makers. Alfred Herbert of Coventry was the largest in Europe. Colchester turned out lathes by the thousand for training shops and general work. There were Harrisons and Wards and the Capstan lathes, and among the prestige names Holbrook and the elegant French machines from Cazeneuve. DSG didn't try to outproduce any of them. It planted itself firmly at the very top of the market and stayed there, building fewer machines, better, for customers who could tell the difference and were willing to pay for it. Those customers were, by now, all over the world. DSG lathes went out across the empire and well beyond it, to Australia, to Japan, to Italy, the Netherlands, Turkey, Spain, Mexico, Argentina. A 1909 account of the great William Beardmore Works in Scotland records 2 DSG lathes of 21-inch centre height, running on beds 60 feet long, machines the size of railway carriages, built to turn the shafts of ships. A photograph survives of a DSG lathe installed in the Petone Railway workshops in New Zealand in 1924. The machines from beside the Worth had reached the far side of the planet. One name from these years deserves a moment on its own. Before the First World War, a young engineer worked for the firm whose name would later belong to the heir. Herbert Smith went on from Keighley to become the chief designer at Sopwith, the man behind the triplane, the Snipe and the Camel, the fighter that more than any other came to stand for British air power in the Great War. The aeroplanes that duelled over the Western Front were shaped, in part, by a mind trained in a lathe works in Yorkshire. When that war came, DSG went to it. Trading now as Dean, Smith and Grace, 1908, Limited, the firm turned its heavy machines to the manufacture of breech blocks for guns and joined the national effort to produce shells. The value of the work was recognised at the very top. A letter from Lord Kitchener himself, dated the 22nd of October 1914, acknowledged what the Keighley firm was contributing to the fight. Barely a decade into the new century, a partnership that had begun with borrowed money was building the components of Britain's artillery, and being thanked for it by the Secretary of State for War. They had arrived, and the best of it was still to come. Chapter 3. The Hands That Scraped the Steel. To understand what Dean, Smith and Grace was at its height, you have to understand what happened on the toolroom floor, because the thing that made a DSG lathe extraordinary could not be cast or machined or bought. It could only be done by hand, by a man with a scraper, 1/1000th of an inch at a time. Hand scraping is an old craft, and a nearly invisible one. When two metal surfaces have to slide against each other with absolute precision, a spindle in its bearing, a saddle along its ways, no machine finish is good enough. So a skilled fitter takes a hand tool and shaves away metal in tiny flecks, testing and shaving and testing again, until the two surfaces bed together so perfectly that they move like oil on glass. On the finest DSG toolroom lathes, the bearings and slideways were scraped this way to accuracies finer than a 10,000th of an inch. To put that in human terms, many times thinner than a sheet of paper, thinner than you can see, thinner than you can feel with a fingertip. At Keighley they had men who lived for this. On the special lathes built for Rolls-Royce, the finest work of all, a fitter named Donald Booth would spend day after day scraping in a single plain white metal bearing. He used red lead rather than the usual engineer's blue to mark the high spots, and he kept at it, hour after hour, morning into afternoon, sometimes for the better part of a week on one bearing, until the test was passed, and the test was severe. A finished component would be measured on a Taylor-Hobson talarond, an instrument that traces the roundness of a surface with almost cruel exactness. The standard Booth worked to was not very good or within tolerance. It was that the talarond should show no bearing marks whatsoever. Nothing. A surface so true the instrument could find no fault in it at all. That was one man, on one kind of machine. There was another whose name the works kept. The 17T toolroom lathe, the jewel of the range, the one every serious shop wanted, was assembled by a single specialist fitter named Tommy Williams, not a team. One man, who built each 17T himself, start to finish, because he loved the work and, as the firm remembered it, wanted no other. He could have moved up, moved on, taken an easier or a better paid job. He chose to stay at his bench and build the finest small lathes in Britain, one at a time, for as long as they'd let him. There is something almost unbearably tender in that, looking back. A man who found the thing he was good at, and the thing he loved, and discovered they were the same thing, and simply did it. Quietly, for years, in a shed in Keighley, turning out machines that would outlive him by half a century. The floor those men worked on was a world of its own. The smell of it, cutting oil, hot metal, the particular mineral tang of swarf coming off steel. The sound, not the frantic din of a textile mill, but something heavier and slower. The deep turning note of the big spindles, the hiss of coolant, the ring of a scraper being drawn across a surface plate. The light came in through high windows and caught the fine bright curls of metal peeling away from the work, and underneath everything, felt through the soles of the boots, more than heard, the low steady weight of very heavy machines running true. The castings themselves began elsewhere, in the foundry, where the semi-steel beds were poured and then left to weather, sometimes for months, so the internal stresses in the metal could settle before a single cut was taken. You cannot rush a DSG bed. It has to age, like timber, until it stops moving of its own accord. Only then does it come into the shop to be planned and bored and finally scraped by hand into something that will hold its shape for 50 years. This was the paradox at the heart of the firm, and it was already visible on the floor, if anyone had cared to look. Every quality that made a DSG the best also made it slow and dear and dependent on a dwindling number of men who could do work that took years to learn. Tommy Williams, building his 17T alone, was a marvel. He was also, though no one would have said it then, a bottleneck, a single pair of irreplaceable hands. The firm's genius and the firm's future weakness were, from the beginning, the very same thing. But in the golden years, that was a shadow no one saw. What they saw was the finished machine, gleaming under the shop lights, hand-scraped to a perfection no rival could match, and the man beside it, in white overalls, wiping down the ways with a rag, quietly proud of the best work in Britain. Chapter 4. The town the lathes built. Those white overalls were not an accident, and they were not off a shelf. Every man at Dean, Smith and Grace wore starched white overalls, and each pair was made to measure for the man who wore it, cut individually by a Keighley tailor called Speaks, not issued by the gross, tailored. One retired employee, talking to a machine tool historian as late as 2015, said he could still fit into the made-to-measure pair he'd bought in 1965 for £5. Half a century on, and the overalls still fitted, and he'd kept them. You can learn almost everything about a firm from a detail like that. This was a company that dressed its workforce in white in a heavy engineering shop, where most firms clothed their men in dark serge precisely because it hid the dirt, and dressed each man in a suit of overalls fitted to his own body. It was saying something. It was saying, our work is clean enough, and our men are good enough to be seen in white. The eccentricities ran all through the place. The works made its own hammers, forging them from lengths of aged railway track. The cutlery in the canteen was stamped, every piece, with the letters DSG. There was a company surgery, fitted out with sunray and infrared lamps for the men's aches and injuries. There was a superannuation scheme, when many working men had no pension at all. There was the firm's own sports field, and a pavilion, and a cricket team. Long service wasn't just noted, it was honoured, in at least one case, past 60 years with the one firm. Fathers followed sons into the gates, and sons followed fathers out. One man's father was a pattern maker there from 1964 until the very end, and his brother served an apprenticeship in the late 1980s. Whole families, whole lives, spent inside those walls. The firm was so woven into the town that Keighley's holidays were arranged around it. When Dean, Smith and Grace shut for its annual break, the town's break followed, because when the work stopped, so much of Keighley stopped with it. That is what it means for a factory to be the heart of a place. Not that it employs people, that the calendar of the town bends itself to the rhythm of the works. At its peak, the firm employed around 1,000 men and women, a figure it would sustain remarkably, right up to 1990. The historian Tony Griffiths described it as conservative, paternalistic, and set to the highest possible standards in every field, from the sublime to the faintly ridiculous. Both halves of that are true, and they are the same thing. The firm that scraped bearings to no marks on a Talleyrand was the same firm that made its own hammers from railway track and stamped its initials on the canteen forks. The obsession was total. It did not distinguish between the important and the trivial. Everything was done properly because there was no other way to do anything. And then came the war that turned that obsession into something the whole nation depended on. From 1938, the firm was run by Sir Harry Smith, alongside James Pearson and Bert Laycock. And when the Second World War came, Dean, Smith and Grace went onto a footing few firms of its size ever reached. It built lathes for every branch of the armed forces, for the Army, the Royal Navy, through the Admiralty, and for the Ministry of Supply. It became one of the first traditionally all-male engineering firms in the district to bring women onto the shop floor in real numbers, the men away at the front, the machines kept running by wives and daughters and sisters, and it reached an output that is difficult to grasp even now. At the peak of the war effort, Dean, Smith and Grace was producing 107 machines a month, one firm, in Keighley. And that output meant that 1 in every 5 lathes made in the whole of Britain, a full fifth of the nation's entire production, was coming out of the works beside the Worth. When Britain called for the machines to arm itself, this small Yorkshire firm answered with a fifth of the total. It even paid for its own Spitfire out of its own pocket in the National Fighter Fund, a single works buying a fighter aeroplane for the country. That was the summit of the firm's importance, and it flowed directly from the reputation the machines had earned. Because here is the double meaning buried in that phrase, the Rolls-Royce of Lathes. It was not only that a DSG was built to Rolls-Royce standards of quality, it was that Rolls-Royce itself, the maker of the aero engines that powered Britain's aircraft, used Dean, Smith and Grace lathes to build its engine parts and recommended them to its own overseas overhaul facilities. The finest engineering firm in the country reached for a Keighley lathe when the tolerances truly mattered. The tools that helped build the engines in the aeroplanes were themselves built beside a river in the West Riding. To be a toolmaker who was allowed to work a DSG in a shop that had them was a mark of arrival. Only time-served, proven men were let near them. There are accounts of men almost coming to blows over who would get to use the DSG rather than the ordinary machines. The feel of the controls under the hand was remembered, decades later, as simply superb. You did not get put on the DSG. You earned it. For a firm born of borrowed money and a Yorkshire field, there was no higher place to stand than this. Chapter 5. The Summit. The war ended, and Dean, Smith and Grace walked straight into its finest years. In 1948, the firm took a new range of machines to the Great Machine Tool Exhibition at Olympia in London, and the range did what the best DSG work always did. It spoke for itself. It won the firm considerable new trade, notably with Canada, opening a market across the Atlantic for the heavy, honest lathes from Keighley. Through the 1950s, the order books were full and the reputation was secure. By 1960, the firm was building engine lathes from 13-inch swing up to 30, alongside surfacing and boring lathes and its celebrated precision toolroom machines, its offices modernized with the latest labor-saving systems. It employed 700 people in 1961 and would climb back towards 1,000. And in 1965, it reached its centenary, 100 years to the year since Dean, Smith and Grace borrowed the money to buy the land. 100 years of building the machines that built everything else. The firm marked it as such a firm would, soberly, proudly, with a photographic tour of the works, men in their white overalls standing beside the machines they'd made. A century old, and by common consent, still the finest maker of manual lathes in Britain, and perhaps anywhere in the world. Standing in 1965, on that anniversary, everything looked as solid as the machines themselves. The name was known across the globe. Rolls-Royce trusted it. Railways and shipyards and tool rooms from New Zealand to Canada ran on it. 1,000 skilled people drew their wages from it in a town whose very holidays bent to its calendar, and the men on the floor were building, by hand, to a standard no competitor had ever matched. But the qualities that had carried the firm to this summit were every one of them about to be tested by a world that was changing faster than Keighley could feel from the inside. Because a DSG lathe was, by its nature, virtually custom-made, massively heavy, hand-fitted, hand-scraped, weathered in the foundry for months, then finished by irreplaceable men who took days over work that could not be hurried. Each machine was a small masterpiece, and each machine took time, and craft, and a depth of skilled labour that grew rarer every year. That had always been the firm's glory. It was about to become its exposure. For elsewhere in the world, engineers were building a different kind of machine entirely, one that did not need a Tommy Williams or a Donald Booth, one that could be told what to do by a set of instructions, and would then repeat the task unattended, to tolerance, all day and all night. The lathe was about to stop being a thing you earned the right to touch, and become a thing you programmed, and the makers who understood that first were not in Keighley, or Coventry, or anywhere in Britain at all. At the centenary, in 1965, no one inside those walls was looking at the horizon. Why would they? They were the best in the world at what they did, and they had been for 100 years. They were standing at the very summit. They could not yet see the cliff. Chapter 6. The machine that needed no hands. Something was happening on the far side of the world, and Keighley could not feel it. It had begun, quietly, in America, in the laboratories of MIT in the late 1950s, where engineers worked out how to control a machine tool, not with a man's hands, but with a set of numerical instructions. Numerical control, they called it. At first, it was crude and huge and hideously expensive and easy to dismiss, but it did one thing that no craftsman, however gifted, could ever do. It could repeat a task exactly, the same cut, the same tolerance, the same part, over and over, unattended, through the night, without tiring, without varying, without needing to have earned the right to be there. The Japanese saw it clearly, and they moved with a patience that ought to have frightened everyone watching. Morisaki had come into machine tools in 1958 and had numerically controlled lathes by 1968, but it was Yamazaki Mazak that drew the map the whole world would follow. In the mid-1970s, Mazak built its slant-turn turning centres. The beds set at an angle so the swarf and coolant fell away clear, the whole thing wrapped around a FANUC control bought in from a specialist rather than built in a back room. And then Mazak did something cleverer still. It built a control it called the Mazatrol, an early conversational system that let a machinist talk to the machine in something close to the language of the workshop, rather than in raw code. A man who had spent his life at a manual lathe could learn it. The barrier came down, and the slant turn became the template, the shape of the modern CNC lathe, copied and refined by every maker on Earth for the next 30 years. Okuma pressed in behind Mazak and Morisaki. In Germany, Gildemeister and others took the high-precision ground that had once belonged to firms like DSG. These machines could run all night in an empty shop. They could outproduce the finest manual lathe ever built, and they did not care in the slightest that a DSG bearing had been scraped to no marks on a Talleyrand, because they could hold their own tolerance, part after part after part, and they never needed a Tommy Williams at all. The Japanese did not beat DSG on quality of craftsmanship. They made craftsmanship, in the old sense, beside the point. Here we must be careful, because the easy story, the story that gets told about Dean, Smith and Grace and put into documentary titles, is that the firm was too proud, too set in its ways, and simply refused to build these new machines, that its craftsmen sneered at electronics and clung to the scraper until the world left them behind. It is a tidy story. It is also not true. Dean, Smith and Grace exhibited a numerically controlled lathe that was reported in the Engineer in June 1968. The same year Morisaki reached the same point in Japan. The firm went on to build a whole run of computer-controlled machines, the CNC 250 and the CNC 305, a numerically controlled lathe called the 30TC, a CNC version of a design called the Metalist, and as late as 1990 to 1992, a new 8-inch chuck machine they called the Slant 200. DSG did not refuse the future. It saw the future, and it built for it. The men in Keighley knew perfectly well what a Mazak could do. They were engineers, not fools, and some of the best in the country. The trouble was never willingness. The trouble was that building the future takes capital, huge, sustained, patient capital, and it takes a healthy market to sell into. And by the time DSG needed both, it had neither. Because all around it, the entire British machine tool industry was quietly dying. Consider the flagship, Alfred Herbert of Coventry, once the largest machine tool maker in all of Europe, the giant of the British trade, the firm against which every other measured itself. By 1975, it was in such trouble that the Secretary of State stood up in the Commons and told the House that its survival would need a radical reconstruction of its capital and up to £25 million of public money. The money went in. It was not enough. When the National Enterprise Board later refused to keep funding it, debts of some £17 million pulled the whole thing down, and Alfred Herbert, the largest in Europe, went into receivership in 1982. If the giant could fall, what chance the specialist beside the worth? And the giants had made their own mistakes in miniature, mistakes that revealed the deeper British disease. British firms had been slow to adopt numerical control at all, slow while the Japanese were already shipping, and when they finally did move, some of them, Herbert among them, made a decision that looks, in hindsight, almost tragic in its pride. They insisted on building their own electronic control systems in-house, chasing a competence utterly outside anything they had ever known, pouring money into electronics laboratories, while the Japanese simply bought proven FANUC controls off the shelf and got on with the business of selling machines. The British firms wanted to own the whole thing, as they always had, as the craft tradition had taught them, and in an age of bought-in electronics, that instinct bled them white. Over all of this fell a series of economic hammer blows that no amount of good engineering could withstand. The oil crisis of 1973, which sent the cost of everything spiralling. The sterling crisis of 1976, so severe it forced Britain to go, cap in hand, to the International Monetary Fund for a loan of £2.33 billion. And then, worst of all for a firm that had lived on exports since the 1880s, the pound itself turned into a weapon aimed at British industry's heart. Think about what this meant on the ground, in the order office at Keighley. Between 1977 and 1980, driven up by North Sea oil and hard money, sterling climbed from around $1.65 to almost $2.45, nearly a 40% rise. Now picture the salesman who had spent 30 years selling DSG lathes to Canada, to Australia, to the shipyards and railway shops of half the world. He goes to his customer with the same fine machine he has always offered. The same steel, the same scraped bearings, the same 50-year guarantee of truth built into every casting. And the price on the invoice, in the customer's own currency, has risen by nearly half. Not because the machine costs more to make, because the pound has risen against the dollar while he wasn't looking. His Japanese rival, meanwhile, offers a CNC machine that costs less, does more, and runs all night. The order does not come. It does not come the next year either. For an export firm, that exchange rate was not an inconvenience. It was a slow strangulation. The deep manufacturing recession of 1980 and 1981 followed, and it fell hardest of all on exactly the kind of firm Dean Smith & Grace was. Heavy, traditional, export-dependent, and proud. This was the world closing in around the works. Not one enemy, a gathering of them, arriving together. The craft was still supreme. The machines were still the best in Britain. And none of it was going to be enough, because the ground the firm stood on was giving way beneath the whole industry at once. Chapter 7. The American Offer. In this closing world, an offer arrived from across the Atlantic, and to the men who received it, it looked less like a threat than a lifeline. The Monarch Machine Tool Company of Sydney, Ohio, was itself a world-class builder of lathes, one of America's finest. It was cash-rich, where DSG was capital-starved. It was modern, where DSG was traditional. And it wanted two things that Keighley had. It wanted the firm's deep engineering expertise to help modernize Monarch's own aging range, because Monarch, too, could feel the Japanese pressure and knew its products were growing old. And it wanted DSG's foundry, which could pour castings for Monarch's American divisions at Sydney and Cortland. There are signs, too, that DSG had already been quietly designing a modern range of its own, with help from Rolls-Royce, the very kind of forward-looking work that a cash-rich parent could bankroll all the way to production. So, the independent firm, a firm that had stood on its own since 1865, that had never in over a century had an outside corporate owner, that had come through 2 world wars answering to no one but itself, was sold to Monarch. The precise year is oddly hard to pin down. The records disagree between 1973 and 1974, and the deal may well have been agreed in 1 year and completed in the next. The best documentary evidence points to 1974. Whatever the exact date, the fact of it was plain. Dean Smith & Grace became the DS&G division of an American corporation, and on the day it happened, it genuinely looked like the right decision. Here was a strong, wealthy, expert parent that understood lathes down to the bone, that respected what DSG was, that had the money to do the modernization the firm knew it needed and could no longer afford alone. A struggling specialist taken under the wing of a giant that spoke its own language. What could be more sensible? A man reading the announcement in the Keighley News that year might reasonably have felt relief. The firm was safe. The Americans had money. The future would be paid for. The trouble with a decision like that is that its wisdom depends entirely on what the new owner does next. And what the new owner does next depends on things happening inside that owner's own walls, thousands of miles away, that the workforce in Keighley could neither see nor influence. You can make a perfectly reasonable decision and still have it destroy you, if the ground shifts under the man you've tied yourself to. For a time, it went well enough. In these years, Monarch had, by the account of John Legger, a Monarch engineer who worked there from 1987 and knew the story from the inside, whose testimony is the closest thing this story has to a witness in the room, a very strong management team. And when Monarch first bought DSG, Legger recalled, the firm was still run by lathemen, people who understood the machines in their hands, people who knew what a scraped bearing was worth and why a bed had to weather for months before it could be trusted. The craft was safe for now, because the men above it still spoke its language and valued what it produced. But 2 companies had now bound their fates together, and neither could see what was coming. Both of them were about to walk into the same storm, the machine tool depression that ran from 1981 to around 1985 and hit the American parent and its English division hard at exactly the same time, in exactly the same way. And here is the cruel arithmetic of it. When both companies are bleeding at once, the strong one cannot rescue the weak one. It is too busy trying to save itself. The lifeline had tied DSG to a swimmer who was, unknowingly, about to start drowning too. That was the real shape of the trap. Not a betrayal. Not a villain twirling a moustache in an Ohio boardroom. A reasonable decision, made in good faith by sensible men on both sides of the Atlantic, that tied a struggling firm's survival to the health of a parent that was about to fall ill itself, just as the whole industry entered its very worst years. The decision was sound the day it was made. The world simply refused to cooperate with it. Chapter 8. The Foundry That Was Left to Starve. If there is a single fatal decision in this story, a moment where the thing might genuinely have gone differently, it is not the sale to Monarch. It is what Monarch did, or rather did not do, in the years that followed. Listen to John Legger again, who was there describing it in words that carry the weight of a man who watched it happen from the inside. When Monarch bought DSG, he said, it was still run by lathemen, and Monarch had a very strong management team then. But in the mid-80s, the parent loosened its control over the English division too much. It let go of the reins at precisely the moment they most needed holding. And the consequence showed up first, and most damagingly, in the one asset that had made DSG worth buying in the first place. The foundry. That foundry. The works on Lorcombe Lane. The Nelson Works, built between 1962 and 1965, in the last confident flush of the Golden Age, was where the whole thing began. It was where the semi-steel beds were poured and then set aside to weather, sometimes for months, until the stresses eased out of the metal and it stopped moving of its own accord. It was the beating heart of the firm's quality, the source of everything that followed, and it had been one of the great prizes of the whole acquisition. The reason in part that Monarch had wanted DSG at all, and in the mid-1980s, with control loosened and attention turned elsewhere, it began to slide. It grew inefficient. Its quality began to suffer. The very source of DSG's greatness started quietly to decay from want of care, not from any single act, but from the slow accumulation of deferred maintenance and postponed investment and attention that never quite arrived. What it needed was a modernization program, real investment, sustained over years, to bring the foundry and the whole operation up to date. Everyone who understood the firm knew it needed one. The engineers on the floor could see it plainest of all, watching the castings and knowing what they should be. And by the time it was needed most, Monarch didn't have the cash to provide it. Because Monarch, by then, was fighting for its own life on its own side of the ocean. The parent's troubles had been mounting, one on top of another, through the very years it should have been reinvesting in Keighley. It had been badly weakened by a long strike in 1975 and 1976, before the DSG relationship had even properly matured. Its own product line had grown expensive and stagnant, the same disease that had felled Alfred Herbert, the same age catching up with the same kind of proud old firm. Then came the failures. A series of prototype machines called the C line, meant to be Monarch's answer to the future, came to nothing and were finally scrapped in 1989. Years of engineering effort and money poured away. And an ambitious project called the Ultra Centre turned into a slow, grinding disaster, its warranty costs running out past whatever profit it had ever managed to make. A machine that cost the company more to stand behind than it ever earned. These were the years, the mid and late 1980s, when the cash that might have modernized the Keighley foundry was instead being consumed by the parent's own failing bets. Presiding over the culture that shaped these years was a figure worth pausing on. Kermit Cook had joined Monarch back in 1935 and become its president in 1961, a man of the old American machine tool aristocracy who had run the company through its confident post-war prime. He retired in 1979, but he did not let go. He kept his seat on the board of directors, and by Legger's account, he had a very demanding personality that went on pressing itself upon the company he had led long after he had formally handed it over. Strong old men who cannot release their grip are a familiar figure in the story of declining firms, and Monarch had one at the very top of the house through the worst of it. Cook died in 1989, in the middle of the wreckage of the scrapped Sea Line, as the parents' difficulties were cresting toward their worst. And this is the quiet tragedy at the centre of the whole story. Not arrogance, not a proud refusal to modernize. The opposite, almost, a firm that wanted to modernize, that knew exactly what it needed, whose engineers understood precisely what was slipping away beneath their hands, and which was owned by a parent too consumed by its own crisis to give it what it needed. Somewhere in the mid-1980s, in offices in Ohio and Yorkshire, in meetings whose minutes no longer survive, the modernization of the Keighley foundry was deferred, and deferred again, and then again. Not by men being careless, but by men who were simply out of money and out of time and out of options. No one chose to let it die. There was no moment when a hard-faced executive decided the foundry should be starved. It died instead of a neglect that no one present had the resources to prevent, 1,000 small non-decisions adding up to one large and irreversible fact. The craft was still there, even now. Even into these years, the men on the floor could still build a lathe to a standard the world could not match. The skill did not vanish, the pride did not fail, the hands still knew what they knew. But a firm cannot live on craft alone when its foundry is failing. Its parent is drowning in its own failed projects. The pound has priced its exports out of every market it once owned, and the Japanese are selling CNC machines by the thousand into the space where DSG used to stand. Craft was necessary. Craft had never been the problem. Craft was simply, now, no longer sufficient, and nothing the men in white overalls could do at their benches could change a single one of the forces bearing down on them from the wider world. The end, when it came, would come from Ohio, but it had been decided in truth years before, in every single quarter when the investment that might have saved the works was not made, because there was nothing left, anywhere in the group, to make it with. Chapter 9. A fortnight before Christmas. On the 11th of December 1992, Monarch announced that it was closing and selling the Dean Smith & Grace facility in Keighley. A fortnight before Christmas. That was the end of it. The end of large-scale manufacturing beside the Worth. The end of a line that ran back 127 years to 3 men and a borrowed field. Around 1,000 people had worked here at the peak, and the firm had held near that number as late as 1990. Now the gates were to close. The honest truth is that we do not have in the public record the granular detail of those final months, the exact tally of redundancies, the precise dates of the last rundown, the names of the last men to clock out on the last day. Those figures are simply not in the heritage archives or the surviving trade press. They live, if they live anywhere, in the memory of the town, in the Keighley news of that winter, in the families who were there. It is an honest gap, and it deserves to be named as one, rather than filled with invention. But we know what a closure like that means, because it is the same in every industrial town in Britain, and it is never, ever abstract. It means a man who had worked at DSG for 30 years, who had earned the right to it, who had almost come to blows once for the privilege of using it, packing his tools into a box. It means the last castings cooling in a foundry that would pour no more. It means the white overalls, made to measure, hung up for the final time. It means a works whose calendar the whole town had once arranged itself around, falling silent in the run-up to Christmas. The presses stopped, the spindles still, the deep turning note that had been the town's background hum for over a century, simply gone. A works that had survived 2 world wars, a works that had made 1 in 5 of the nation's lathes when the nation needed them most, a works whose machines Rolls-Royce trusted with its finest engine parts. It did not fall to catastrophe or scandal or a single arrogant blunder. It closed quietly a fortnight before Christmas 1992 because the industry it belonged to had already died around it, and its distant parent had run out of the money and the will to keep 1 English division alive. There was a coda still to come, easily confused with the closure, but separate from it. The old Monarch-era corporate shell was formally wound up 3 years later. A liquidation notice appeared in the London Gazette in December 1995. But that was paperwork, the tidying away of a legal entity long after the fact. The real ending, the human ending, the one the town actually felt in its bones, had come at the end of 1992. Everything after was aftermath. Chapter 10. The name that would not die. And yet, and this is the strange, stubborn grace of this story, the name did not die. Almost uniquely among the great British industrial collapses, Dean Smith & Grace refused to become simply a memory. On the 5th of April 1993, only months after the closure, a privately owned Keighley company called DSG Lathes Ltd bought the assets and carried on, building manual and CNC lathes, rebuilding old machines, supplying spares to the hundreds of DSG lathes still working around the world. The heart had stopped, but a pulse remained. Then, on the 1st of February 2005, came a genuine attempt at revival, led by a man whose whole life had, in a sense, prepared him for it. Nigel Granger was an ex-Rolls-Royce apprentice, trained, that is, in the very tradition of precision that Dean, Smith and Grace had served for a century. There is a rightness to that which needs no underlining. He completed a management buyout, revived the full Dean, Smith and Grace name, and set about rebuilding what he could. He pushed turnover from under £1 million in 2004 towards £2.25 million and, fittingly, perfectly, he sold that new output largely to British aerospace firms. New CNC machines, carrying the old name, going once again to the industry that builds the engines of aircraft, the same industry the firm had served since Kitchener's letter. When Granger took the firm on, his new premises in Pitt Street faced the original Dean Smith and Grace building. The underinvestment of the Monarch years, he found, was still clearly evident in what he had inherited. He was, in the most literal sense, rebuilding across the street from where it had all begun. It did not last, but it did not simply end either. The firm went into administration in 2008 and was bought by Newsmith Stainless Ltd of Robertstown. In 2012, it passed to the Machine Tool Technology Group of Halifax, and in 2015, this is the true final chapter for the town, that group moved the operation out of Keighley altogether, over to Halifax, ending 150 years of Dean Smith and Grace manufacturing in the place that had given it its name. By then, the workforce that carried the name had fallen to around 17 people, 1,000 once, 17 at the end. The name lives yet as a machine tool services, rebuild and spares business, a short distance, as they put it, from where the story started a century and a half ago. But Keighley's part in it closed in 2015, for good. The buildings, some of them, outlasted the work. The former DSG offices on Pitt Street were still standing when a local historian photographed them in February 2021. Brick that had watched the whole arc from the borrowed field to the empty floor. What has become of the sites since, precisely how the Pitt Street offices and the old Worth Valley Works and the Lorcombe Lane foundry have been used or redeveloped, is not fully recorded in the sources that survive. It is one more thing that would take a walk through Keighley to know for certain. What is certain is that the making left the town for good. But the machines. Ah, the machines. Because here is where a firm that built for 50 years, not for 5, has its final and quietest vindication. Dean Smith and Grace lathes are still cutting metal, right now, today, in professional shops and heritage workshops around the world, and not as curiosities, but as working tools that men choose over newer machines. There is a Type 17, built in December 1958, still turning at the Great Central Railway workshops at Loughborough, 60-odd years old, still earning its place among the engines it helps to keep alive. There is a DSG in the workshop of the Brecon Mountain Railway, up in the hills of South Wales, machining parts for locomotives that carry visitors through the beacons. There is one at the Dolaucothi gold mines, and one at the Festiniog Railway's Boston Lodge Works, the oldest railway works in the world, and a Keighley lathe still fit to serve it. There are DSG machines held for their history in the Bradford Industrial Museum, in the Cambridge Museum of Technology, in the Science Museum Group's collection. The engineering laboratories at Manchester ran DSG machines that were still being cited in serious research in this century. Machines built for a wartime shop, still good enough for 21st century science. Owners report machines 55 years old that still cut to within 0.005 of an inch, a tolerance that would embarrass a great many things built last year. The hollow spindle Type 25P remains the machine of choice in the oil and gas industry for turning and threading pipe, a specialist survivor doing specialist work no one has found a better tool for. And here is the detail that says everything, the one figure that ought to be carved above the empty gates. Second-hand DSG lathes have been known to sell for more than they cost when they were new, more than their original price, decades on, in real money. In a world built on things designed to be thrown away, a Keighley lathe from the Golden Age can be worth more today than the day it left the works. There may be no purer testament in all of British industry to what those men in white overalls actually made. One editor at the trade magazine Machinery recorded watching a 13-year-old DSG CNC machine take a cut in a tough aerospace alloy, a cut that twisted a modern imported CNC lathe out of true. The old firm's engineering, more than a decade old, still humbling the new. The scraper still beating the spreadsheet, in the one arena where the two could still be set against each other and measured. Chapter 11. What the silence keeps. Stand for a moment, where it started, beside the Worth, under the gritstone moors, in a town that once arranged its holidays around a works. There were 3 men and a borrowed field, and an idea so simple it could be said in a single breath, that a machine's worth is measured not by what it costs to make, but by how long it goes on being true. They built a firm on that idea, and the firm built the machines, and the machines built the engines and the ships, and the guns and the locomotives, the tools, behind almost everything Britain made for 100 years. When the nation needed lathes to arm itself against Hitler, this one small works in Yorkshire made a 5th of them. When Rolls-Royce needed to build the engines that would fly, it reached again and again for a Keighley lathe. And it fell, not through arrogance, not through one great blunder, not through a proud refusal to change. It saw the future clearly and it built for it, from that first numerically controlled lathe in 1968 to the Slant 200 at the very end. It fell because the whole industry it belonged to was dying at once, because a strong pound priced its work out of the world it had sold to for a century, because a distant parent, tied to it in good faith, ran out of the money to save it, because a foundry, the beating heart of the thing, was left to starve when there was nothing left, anywhere, to feed it. Tragedy here did not arrive as villainy. It arrived as a long series of reasonable decisions, made by decent men under pressures none of them could master, until, a fortnight before Christmas, the gates closed. The men are the thing to hold on to. Donald Booth, scraping a single bearing for the better part of a week until an instrument could find no fault in it at all. Tommy Williams, who built the finest small lathe in Britain alone, at his own bench, for years, because he loved the work and wanted no other. The man who kept his made-to-measure white overalls for half a century and could still fit into them, and kept them anyway, because they meant something no one can hang up. They are all gone now, or very nearly, but their work is not. Somewhere today, in a railway workshop, an oil field machine shop, a museum where a wheel still turns, a Dean Smith & Grace lathe is running. 60 years old, 70, still holding a tolerance that shames the machines that outlived the firm that made it. It does not know its makers are gone. It does not know its town lost its works a fortnight before Christmas in 1992. It simply goes on doing the one thing it was built to do, better than almost anything built since, because the men who made it could imagine no other way of making anything. That is what the silence in Keighley keeps. Not a ruin, not a lesson. A standard, held in cast iron and scraped steel, still true after all this time, in the hands of people who never knew the men in white, but are grateful, every working day, for what those men left behind. The works is quiet now, but listen to a DSG underload, somewhere in the world, cutting clean and true through hardened steel, and you can still hear them.